Our speaker today is Anandi Geroy. She has just been doing a marvelous job of talking about all the deities of Hinduism. And today there are more avatars of Vishnu. Vishnu has a lot of avatars. The most fascinating one to me was that he's also Krishna and Buddha, like all of these lifetimes. That was big news for me. I didn't know that. But for those who don't know, Anandi lived in India for 7 years, and that's how she knows all this stuff. Studying dance, percussion, language, culture, and religion. She has taught theater and dance in India, San Francisco, and Taos, and has adapted a number of folk tales from across the world for the stage. She works with the children of Tisa, teaching dance, theater, and folk arts. She is a milker of cows, which isn't on your bio, but I happen to know this about her. And she sings to the cows while she's milking them, so it's very holy, holy milk. Please welcome Anandi.
Good morning. It's so nice to be here. Nice to see Kuan Yin behind me too. I've been thinking about Buddhism because I'm talking about Buddha today as an avatar of Vishnu, which is just sort of an interesting perspective on that tradition and lineage, and sort of looking at him both. Excuse me. So Vishnu has 10 avatars generally recognized, and there's different versions of them. Depending on who you ask, sort of, or what region you are talking about.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do they all have to be born in India or in similar places? Is that part of the deal with avatars?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think like these 10 are from the Puranas, and so that's Purana means literally old. So they're from a time when Indian Hinduism was pretty India-centric. So I think like these kind of traditional 10 are all from India. But like, for example, when I first started studying dance, my dance teacher actually came up with an original dance drama. And this was Indian classical dance called Avatar. And we had all kinds of, we had Jesus in there, and we did, danced Jesus as an avatar. So this sense of like that all holy beings who come to like give a massive input of spiritual teaching and energy to humanity and to the world are in a sense avatars. All of them. So but it just depends, I think, who you ask and what the concept is around it, how open and inclusive. But that's one of the things I wanted to talk about today, is that Hinduism really has this kind of like enfolding quality to it. And I think in some ways that's partly socio-political, kind of wanting to enfold whatever spiritual lights kind of shine in India into the fold of Hinduism. And so I think that's a piece of bringing Buddha, kind of acknowledging Buddha as, oh, well, he's an avatar of Vishnu. That's kind of part of what we're already doing. Like, he's not just doing a new thing. Because if you look now at India, there's not a lot of Indian Buddhists today. There are some, but it's not one of the major religions of India, but it originated there. And at the time of the historical Buddha, and the years not too long after that, when his disciples kind of went out, during his lifetime, there was also a lot of spreading of the Buddha's teaching throughout India. And many kind of influential political figures, kings, and various like leaders of dynasties in India were converted to Buddhism, and it really spread. And I think, in some senses that was a political threat, or a threat to the status quo in India when you look at it from that perspective. So that's one reason why Buddha was enfolded into kind of the fold of Hinduism, to kind of say, oh, well, he's part of it. He's part of what we're already doing. You don't have to like radically change your beliefs. Because a big piece of what he taught was, well, you don't have to rely on anyone outside yourself as a medium, intermediary between you and your direct experience of the truth, the all-pervading reality. You don't need a priest. You don't need a guru. I mean, he said, look, he studied with a variety of different teachers in his lifetime, but he kind of ultimately came to his own truth. And that's why followers of him, like his was such a separate path. He came up with such a unique perspective, and it was non-deific. There was no deity involved, and it wasn't like do something during this life and you'll achieve something in an afterlife. It was all about direct experience of truth right here. And his final words were practice diligently. He said all composite things eventually decay, basically saying this body is dying because it's just all kind of the cause and effect of the natural world. My body is also subject to those laws, but and practice diligently, because it all is all impermanent. So he said, I can't give you an experience of that. You have to experience that. You have to practice. It was very liberating, and also at the same time, a big responsibility, a big sense of self-responsibility for the practitioners. So that was really, unique. And it also, he had a lot of lay disciples. So he wasn't saying you have to, he also had a lot of monastic disciples, but there was a huge lay community that were his disciples as well. So he said, anyone can access these teachings, anyone can access this truth. It's available to all of us, but you have to, practice. You have to really put in the hours, sit on the cushion or practice in life, the teachings. And then he gave the Noble Eightfold Path. So I'm going to talk a little bit about actually Buddha's life story from the perspective of him as an Indian in that time, and in a way from the perspective of the Puranas, which add a lot of mythical sort of extrapolations onto his life, which is, that's the lens that these lectures are taking. So we'll talk about Buddha in that way. And I'm wondering though, do you guys have a lot of Buddhist speakers who come in, or every so often?
Sean Murphy always does his, version, which is, I guess, more Zen,
okay,
more Asian.
Yeah.
Other Buddhist, we have had a couple. Yeah, we have had a couple
here and there.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, because I'm not going to get really deeply into the details of the Buddha's teachings, or even how that differed from kind of the philosophy that he trained in, or what kind of philosophies were roaming around India at the time when he was studying with various masters. But that is really interesting, and I could talk about that on a different day if you wanted, unless that's a repeat for you guys.
No, it's not a repeat. What's fascinating really is, that it's all inside of you, and Jesus was also, it's all inside of you, and, pissing off the status quo, who, wanted you to go through them to get there.
Pay them a fee for it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
No, that's very much what Buddha was. He was totally radical. And then
did Vishnu have that quality too?
Vishnu was the preserver. So for him, it's really about preserving the status quo. So I think interestingly, Buddha was enfolded into that as a way of saying, let's not, it's interesting. I'm also going to talk about Kalki, and Kalki is the avatar yet to come, who in many religions, there's this idea of someone like an apocalyptic vision, or in Hinduism, it's cyclical, though. It's not like the end. Every end, is a new beginning. So, which makes so much sense when you think about the way the world and time work. It is very much a cycle. I've just been sharing a lot about the seasons with the kindergartners that I teach, and it's so fun for them to have this aha moment about how things go round and round. I love that. It's really fun to experience that with them. But yeah, so in Hinduism, it definitely goes round and round. And in Buddhism too, his first teaching was at the deer park in Sarnath, which is outside Varanasi, and he taught the 5 bhikshus, or the 5 were sort of the renunciates that he had been practicing with. But I'll get there. Okay, let me start at the beginning. I'll get to the first turning of the wheel when we get there. But first, I'm actually going to talk about another avatar, because I had 3 that I wanted to touch on today out of the 10. These are the last 3. Well, I didn't talk about Krishna because he needs at least 3 talks just for Krishna. But I want to talk about Parshuram. Parshu means axe. So Rama with the axe is Parshuram. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on him. It's another interesting avatar that I feel like was not an unfoldment in the same way that Buddha was, but more of like an unfoldment of like a historical king and sort of a historical actually animosity between these two groups. And that sort of unfolded into an avatar of Vishnu. So in the caste system in India, there's the Brahmin priestly caste. And there's a lot of these Puranic stories that are about holy sages and mendicants and people who have these ashrams in the forest, that various kings will visit them, and kind of these interactions between the Kshatriya caste, which are the ruling caste in terms of the political warrior rulers. So those who have armies and, fight one another for land and control in the political social sphere. And then there are the Brahmins who can fill a lot of roles in that Hindu society. Some of them are the priests and advisors to the Kshatriyas. Some have these hermitages in the forest, and in that way, have a sort of amount of power in terms of having a lot of disciples in the forest and being these kind of respected, powerful beings that usually in these mythical stories have kind of magical powers because they've spent so much time in spiritual practice that they've developed these yogic powers. So you have these two groups in some ways vying for types of power, either power in the socio-political realm or power in the spiritual realm. And in this story of Parshuram, those two come head to head. And the way it happens is there was a sage and his wife, and the sages also have wives and they have children. So most of them are, it's kind of like they're not renouncers of everything. Maybe their disciples are, and they live in kind of like an ashram situation, but then the disciple might go on and start their own thing and get married and sort of start a community in some ways, like a spiritual community, a commune, as it were. So these guys were flourishing in ancient India. So there was a sage and his wife, and the wife, they wanted to have a son to continue their ashram and continue their lineage. But the wife was not actually a Brahmin. So the sage was a Brahmin, so the priestly caste. His wife was a Kshatriya. She was a princess, and she had come to live with him. That princess, her mother, was also a queen and, was also still bearing children. So in this story, the sage gives a special food. And oftentimes when people want a son and they're making a prayer in the Vedic world for a child, they'll make offerings to the fire, for example, and they'll be instructed or get this kind of special food that the wife is supposed to eat, and then they'll bear like a special son. So a lot of the stories have that element. So the sage queen gets this special food that she's supposed to eat to have a very enlightened, a spiritually powerful, potent son, who would kind of receive the potent benefits of the father's austerity and spiritual practice. But she says, well, my mother also wants to have another son. Can I get one for her too? But she's a queen. And so they give her a special dish that is supposed to make a son who's very strong in martial prowess to be a very strong prince and leader of people. So the wife takes the two dishes and goes to her mother and says, I've got one for you, I've got one for me. But the mom somehow convinces her daughter that they need to switch them so that the daughter can have a son that will rule the world. Like, don't you want a son that will rule the world? You really do. Come on, eat the one that's supposed to make a powerful warrior. And so the daughter gets convinced, okay, mom, I guess you're right. And she eats it. and comes back to her husband, who with his psychic sagely powers sees what she's done and gets really annoyed and says, what have you done? Now our son, who we're going to raise in this hermitage to take on and run this ashram in the future, is going to be this warrior who's going to want to fight with everyone. And your mom is going to have this son who just wants to leave the palace and go off into the woods. Like, does that make sense? You have to, basically saying in another way, in terms of Vishnu's, really gives this message all the time about keep the status quo as it should be, right? So, stay in your allotted path in life. We all have our place. We all have our purpose. We all work together. Don't go off on the fringe. Just do what you're supposed to do. Follow the path of your parents. And so she says, oops, sorry, I messed up. Well, I don't really want my son to be like that. Can you at least forgive me and let it be my grandson that is that way? And so the father says, okay, fine. Does his spiritual magic, and the son is a follower in the ashram and fits in well. But his son, so the son is named Jamadagni. He marries another princess named Renuka, and they have a son named Parashuram. So Parashuram, he's the youngest of 5 brothers, and he is very warrior-like from his birth. Always wanting to fight, picking up weapons, and they're like, okay, here it is, he's come, the one we've been waiting for. This is actually an avatar of Vishnu. And the story is that the Kshatriyas, the warrior class at that time, were getting too big for their britches, and they were also overstepping the bounds of propriety in terms of their warrior prowess. So they were misusing their power as warriors and as political leaders to oppress the masses, and they were becoming too strong. So this Parshuram was born in order to right the balance, and that's Vishnu's work always, is to kind of right the balance. When things get out of balance, he comes and he kind of rights it. This is a very gory, bloody story. So it happens to be this avatar who is this incarnation of God, but who goes and does lots of destruction. So he comes to the earth, the father, Jamadagni, and oftentimes these rishis or spiritual sages also have this intense anger that they also hold. And if you anger them, they can curse you, and it gets really bad because they also have these psychic yogic powers that they can use to curse you. So the wife one day goes off and she's getting water for her husband. And while she's busy at the stream getting water, she happens to see this celestial king sporting with his wives in the water. And for a moment, she wishes, oh, that looks fun. I wish I could do that instead of doing what I'm doing. But then she's, oh no, what an impious thought. I'm here to cleanse myself and get this ritual water for my husband. So she fills the pitcher, goes back, and Jamadagni, with his spiritual powers, sees what's happened. She's a second late for his ritual. He gets really mad. And in his rage, he says, woman, I can't believe I'm not going to take this water from you. It's impure. And you were having these impure thoughts at the holy stream, getting my holy water. I'm cursing you to death. And he asks his sons to cut off the head of their mother.
Nasty.
Bad news, right? So the oldest son is like, Dad, I don't think I can. They're all very holy, the first 4, but of course Parshuram is ready to go. He says, okay, Dad, I'll follow your command. And he cuts off his mother's head. And then the dad gets so mad that he says, well, in some versions, why don't you cut off all your brothers' heads too? Because they didn't follow my instructions. So Parshuram says, okay, takes his axe, cuts everybody's heads off. The father is so happy with his son that he says, I'll give you a boon. And the son says, well, would you please put the heads back on our family members so we can go on with life? And the father says, okay. And then, of course, his anger is spent and he repents. Parshuram also needs to be cleansed of this sin of killing his mother and his brothers for a minute. So he also goes and is told to do a bunch of austerities. He prays to Lord Shiva for many, many years and actually gains all of these stronger boons of martial prowess from him. So he gets all these magical weapons, including this axe that is his namesake because he's called Rama with the axe. So he goes around with this axe. at some point they have so one thing that the father decides to do as kind of like a way to repent for what he's done is to ask for Kamdenu, who's she's figured in some of our other stories. She's the cow of plenty. So she is the celestial cow that provides all things, not only like endless milk. And in fact, her milk is what's supposed to fill the ocean of milk in which Lord Vishnu, in the time of dissolution between the end of one world and the beginning of the next world, reclines on his serpent in this ocean of milk. And that all comes from Kamdenu, who's also called Surabhi. And our cow is also called Surabhi. So she's named after her. So Kamdenu comes to their hermitage, and the Kamdenu will only come to the hermitage of someone who's really very pure. So Jamadagni does lots and lots of tapas and penance and repentance, and eventually like sort of purifies himself from that angry outburst. And Kamadhenu agrees to come and stay with them. So this cow brings with her, I mean, the cow in India, we had a whole talk on the cow, but I mean, she is the embodiment of auspiciousness. So when she is with you, it's like having the goddess Lakshmi, who is the embodiment of all wealth, all abundance, at your side. So the cow, having a cow in your world is like really having the full energy of absolute abundance and plenty just with you always. So this cow is the ultimate version of that. And not only does she give you whatever you want to eat, but like anything you want, she produces. So she's the wish fulfilling cow. So this cow is there, and as in a previous story, a king comes, and this is the king who, so he's actually a devotee of Vishnu, and this whole sort of Leela, this whole divine drama happens because the Kshatriyas, like I said, were getting too powerful, but this king himself is a devotee, and he got a boon that when it came his time to die, he would die at the hand of Vishnu. And that in Vishnu coming to earth as this avatar of Parshuram, he would both grant the boon of his great devotee of sending him off to the netherworld, and at the same time destroy the Kshatriyas, who this king is just barely keeping in check from really like getting very demonic in their activities. So, okay, the king comes. He sees Kamdenu. He's greeted by the sage and welcomed by him and fed by him. And he goes back home, and one of his ministers sort of poisons his mind and says, that wish-fulfilling cow is pretty awesome. I think that you should have it because you're the king, right? And you should have all the things. So you should really go and take that cow, because why not? He's just a sage. You can take the cow. Like, just go get it. Go get the cow. And so the king sends that emissary back to get the cow, and of course the sage and everybody at the hermitage says, no, don't take this cow. It's like, we're very attached to it. It's our auspiciousness. You can't just take it from us. But they have this battle. The king, the emissary actually kills Jamadagni, Parshuram's father, in the struggle over the cow. And then the cow herself becomes incredibly angry that her master is laying there dead. And she produces all of these warriors out from her. And they attack the emissary, and there's this huge battle. And, they go home defeated, but they end up taking her calf. So Parshuram comes back and finds his father dead, and he vows to kill the king who did this to his father. So they have this epic battle. He kills that king, but the king's sons come again and and he brings his father back to life. This sage Jamadagni comes back to life like 3 times. So first he dies, comes back to life. The king the king dies at the hand of Parshuram, but his sons come to avenge his father's death. They end up killing him again. Parshuram returns and says, I can't believe my father's dead again. Okay, come back to life. I'm going to kill the sons. And they get into this whole like feud thing that just goes on and on and on. Eventually, Parshuram vows to exterminate the Kshatriya race, the whole caste of warriors, 21 times. So he actually exterminates them all, but then their wives are still alive, and they make a new round of Kshatriyas. He exterminates them. It happens 21 times. This is really gory, guys. I'm sorry, I'm just the relator. This lake fills with their blood. Okay, this entire lake is full of the blood of the Kshatriyas, and Parshuram actually goes there, and there's a ritual in India that one does that to propitiate your ancestors. So he does, and you use water. Okay, you take water, you offer it to the sun, you make water offerings to the ancestors. So he actually does it with the blood in the lake. I know. He offers the blood to his ancestors kind of as this, I don't know. I really tried to find some redeeming qualities in this story, but I wanted to share it with you because it is one of the avatars. So take it and muse on it. I mean, some things that I've read too is, really this was about a historical battle and these power struggles between the warrior caste and the Brahmin caste. In the same way that Buddhism was kind of enfolded into Hinduism, these sort of political battles were also kind of enfolded in as like, okay, this is part of this avatar of Vishnu, and he was coming to right the wrongs, and this being Parshuram was deified in that way. But so that's his story. He exterminates the bad warriors and rights the balance. Okay, Parshuram done. Now we get to talk about Buddha, a much more gentle being. So in between those two avatars, we have Ram and Krishna, which we're going to give them their own at least one day, because there's also these two epics, which I'm sure you've heard of, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which are massive epic stories of India, which are about Rama and Krishna respectively. Or the Mahabharata is about so many things, but Krishna's in there. They say in India actually that it's so long and so complex that if something's not in the Mahabharata, it doesn't exist. Like it contains sort of everything in it. It's the all-encompassing text. So we'll spend some time on that, but not today. So then comes Buddha, and then finally Kalki, the avatar yet to come. And in Buddhism, that there is a bodhisattva yet to come, who's called Maitreya, who's actually going to come at the end of the age, and in the same way be this sort of like redeeming salvation sort of character. But so Buddha, from this perspective of being an avatar, when we used to dance, actually, we had a dance when I was studying Indian classical dance where we would dance the avatars of Vishnu. And, because there are 10, we just kind of touched on each one. But the kind of the thing we focused on with Buddha from the Hindu perspective was that he stopped the practice of animal sacrifice. So that's kind of an interesting way to look at like Buddha's purpose from a Hindu Vedic perspective, that there was a lot of, not lots, but in certain sects of Hinduism, there was animal sacrifice. It was actually pretty big in Vedic times. Animal sacrifice. And so Buddha said, no, don't kill the animals. Like everyone's a sentient being. Let's, honor all life basically, and not kill, basically he said ritualistic activities in this way aren't really the way. They aren't really the path to enlightenment. Following these Vedic rituals that you need a priest and an intermediary, and you offer all these things and you do this very highly ritualized activity is not the way to actually understand the truth. It's through just getting quiet. Much more simple, much more difficult in some ways. But interestingly, if you look at Tibetan, and I'm not an expert at all in Buddhism, but just from what I know, if you look at Tibetan Buddhism or even Zen Buddhism, there's this simplicity, but there's also this highly regimented ritualistic aspect. So Buddhism, I think, again, like as it traveled outside of India and where it was picked up more, like in India now, it's kind of had its heyday and sort of passed on to other parts of Asia and the US even too, obviously everywhere. That ritualistic, it was enfolded into like currently existing ritualistic practices from different countries too. If you look at like Pure Land Buddhism, or they talk about anyway, there's lots of ideas of heavens and devas and different things. And so in this version of Buddha's life, there are those beings as well. So he was born to a king and a queen. Mahamaya was his mother's name, which actually in Sanskrit, it means the great illusion. And his father was a king. And when she found out she was pregnant, she wanted to leave the hustle and bustle of the world. And she went to these gardens called Lumbini, which were these famous gardens that were full of beautiful fountains and flowers and peaceful animals. And she just was just became sort of one with nature in these gardens as she gestated the Buddha in her womb. And when he was born, all of these auspicious things happened. It was the Buddha moon just happened. It's celebrated in different ways in different places, but in May, the full moon in May is also the Buddha's birthday, his death day, and his enlightenment day are all celebrated on that full moon. So we just had that sort of wisdom moon pass. And so he was born on that full moon day in the Garden of Lumbini. And they say, according to this myth, that he didn't come out from his mother the way people normally do. He actually came out of her side and caused her no pain or any kind of suffering or confusion in the mind. He just sort of like emerged from her side very like peacefully. And there he was. And he took 7 steps on his first day. And they were sort of these auspicious steps and marks on the ground, and pure water, warm and cold streams of water came from heaven and bathed him at his birth. And all of the gods, they realized that a special being, a being who was already enlightened and didn't need to come to the earth, but just came to share the truth and awaken all beings had arrived. So there were all of these auspicious marks. He had auspicious marks on his feet. The wheel with 1,000 spokes was on his feet, and the various sages were seeing lots of auspicious portents around who lived kind of in the area. So they came to visit them, the king and queen. And one of the sages said, began to cry when he actually saw the baby Buddha. And the king and queen got upset. And the king said, "What's wrong? Are you seeing something for our son's life that is terrible?" And he said, No, I'm so old I can't contain my tears, but I'm so happy at the birth of this being that he's going to liberate. So he's going to bring the essence of the truth onto this earth. But here's the thing about him. He's got all these auspicious marks, and he could either be a really incredible king and ruler of people, or he could leave all that and go for the deeper truth and spread that truth. And leave all the trappings of the kingdom. Of course, the king wanted his son to be a king as he was. And so he got a little bit worried about the possible second fate of his son. And so they brought him home to the palace, and they set everything up so that he would never, ever have to see suffering in any way, so that he wouldn't ever want to go deeper. He wanted the son to just live a life of pleasure. Follow your path you've been given, follow in the footsteps of your parents. Don't go deeper, because suffering makes you go deeper, right? Suffering really makes you question. It makes you search for a deeper truth and a deeper reality. Of course, this was his fate, but his father was doing his best to put his hand in between. So the child grew up with every pleasure in the world, in the most beautiful palace with minstrels and dancers and gardens, and never knew suffering. And when he came of age, his father found a beautiful wife for him who would be absolutely captivating, along with many beautiful concubines in case he wanted lots of women. There were just everything for him. He had a son named Rahul, and the father finally started to relax. Like, okay, he's got a wife, he's got a son, he must be pretty attached at this point. He's not going to want to leave. But one day, in actually the height of the beauty, in the perfection of this life of pleasure, it was a spring day. The garden was blooming. Imagine lilacs and beautifully scented things, and birds were chirping. And he had this desire sort of awaken in him. I've never seen outside the palace gates. I'd really like to go out there and explore more of the beauty of this world. I'd like to see what's out there, what flowers might be blooming just outside the garden walls. And the father said, uh-oh, but he didn't want to show his young son, Siddhartha, that he was worried. So he said, okay, yeah, you can go out there. I'll send your charioteer around, and we'll get it ready for you to take a journey. Meantime, the king goes and tells all his ministers, look, I don't want him seeing anything bad on this journey. So we're going to mark out the exact parade route, okay, of this chariot, and everywhere that he's going, all the sick people, dead people, dirty stuff, anybody old is not going to be on the route. We're going to clean the streets, and we'll strew them with flowers and spray a bunch of perfume. So he got that all organized while he was sort of stalling his son eventually he gets in the chariot and he goes along. But according to this story, of course, because it's from a Hindu perspective, there was a deva, a god, or a benevolent spirit that came down because the Buddha's path was what it was, and that needed, his fate had to be, right. So the gods had to kind of make it happen. So a god came and took the form of an old man who was just struggling and on the very edge of life and death, and kind of struggling to breathe, struggling to move, and planted him right there along the flower-strewn path. And when young Siddhartha saw him, he said, what's wrong with that man? Was he born like that? Or did he get all parched out in the sun? Like, what happened? What's going on? I've never seen anything like that. And the charioteer said, oh dear, I've got instructions from the Father. But he found himself just sort of saying, that's old age, and everyone is susceptible to this, my Lord. Even you will end up in this way someday. And the young prince was so confounded. His mind was completely reeling. He had no idea that this was coming. He said, take me back to the palace. So he goes back and he's sort of digesting it. And he's digesting it and he said, okay, let's try again. I want to go out again. Let's go out again. So they go out again. Same thing. The Father says, okay, now this time we're going to double it up. Nobody is getting past the guards that are stationed just outside of what my son can see, keeping all the bad and yucky stuff away. But of course, another deva comes down and plants himself right along the path. And this time he's a sick man and he's suffering terribly from leprosy or some horrible disease. And he's just obviously in lots of pain and swollen. So Siddhartha sees him and is completely confounded and confused and tells his charioteer, what's wrong with this man? What's going on? I don't understand. What's happening? And he says, this is sickness, my king, my prince, and no one escapes it. Everybody experiences sickness and suffering at some point in their life. The humors in the body, basically the elements in the body are just twisted and wrong. Something's going on with the bodily elements. They're not in balance, in harmony, and aligned, and that's what happens. So the prince says, oh, take me back. He goes back home. He's kind of digesting. Says, okay, let's try again. Third time they go. And here comes the deva again and plants himself as a corpse. And the corpse is being carried by 4 corpse bearers, and they're chanting Ram Nam Satya, as they do in India when they're heading out to the cremation ground. And this time Siddhartha is completely shocked. Like, what is going on? What is this? Why is he just laying there inert? Something feels so wrong here, so off. What's happening? And there are people, wailing and crying. I said, that's death. That's death. That's reality for all of us. Even you will face that when your time comes, Siddhartha. So he returns and he's just flabbergasted, and Dad says, oh gosh, what am I going to do? It's happening. Send some more dancing girls. Distract him. But Siddhartha's totally not into it. He's like, you know what? I know I'm still like a young teenage man, but these girls have no interest for me. I need to digest what I just saw. So he goes and just starts sitting quietly, and he says, I'd like to go one more time. He goes with the charioteer, and this time he goes to a park, and he just sits and is just kind of like thinking about what he's seeing, thinking about it. And he sees the deva again in the form of a bhikshu, a mendicant, a wandering sadhu, who comes to him with a begging bowl. And he says, well, what are you doing? Like, what's your story? And so he says, look, I've left my life. I've left all my pleasures. I've left my family, and I'm searching for the truth of old age, suffering, and death. And I'm going to continue this journey until I find the truth of that. What's beyond all of this? That's my quest. That's my life's purpose. So he says, oh, you can do that? And the light bulb goes off, and he says, that's me. That is me. Sign me up. And he goes back home, and he says to his charioteer, look, I want to go. This is my path. Like, I know this is what I'm supposed to do. And he says, well, are you sure? You have this wife, you have this son. Like, can't leave them. They'll be so sad. And he tries to kind of like hook him in with his attachments. And finally, Siddhartha says, look, I've got to go in the middle of the night. Like I've got to just go when no one will see me and try to hold me back, because I know I have to do this and I got to stay strong. So he waits until nighttime and everyone's asleep. And he just, says his goodbyes to his sleeping wife, who he loves, his son. He loves them deeply, but he knows that the best way that he can serve them, and not only them, but all beings, is to follow this path of his heart. He has to follow it. So he goes out in the night without saying goodbye and takes his horse and goes off. And eventually, he's traveling with the charioteer and he says, look, this is where I have to leave you. Sends him back. He says, here, take my jewels, take this back to my father. Maybe these jewels will help you in your moments of sadness, missing me, but tell them that I had to go and I'm not coming home until I find the answer. And so he goes off and he studies with the various teachers. And maybe we can have another talk on kind of like what they're teaching and then why he kind of rejects all of those teachings. But eventually he starts doing what is the practice of the day, which is self-mortification, mortification of the flesh, basically, to go to find out what's beyond. And so he's with these 5 bhikshus, these 5 other monks, and they're practicing together. And it's kind of this like, who can do the most intense sadhana, like I'm going to not eat for 10 days. I'm not going to eat for 20, they just become really, really emaciated, do all these crazy penances and just trying to like get beyond the physical. And he's eventually, gets to this point where his self-determination is excellent. And he becomes famous for his ability to do these intense practices better than anyone. Finally, he's sitting, eating 1 grain of rice a day. His body is like this withered, it's just completely dried out. Everyone who's hearing about him starts to come and visit him and see like, who is this guy? What's he doing? What's he going to achieve? He kind of gets this notoriety and fame. Excuse me. One day he finally says like, what is this really doing for me? Like, I know that like I'm increasing my willpower and I'm getting very skinny and I may die doing this, but really where am I getting, So he says, I'm going to get up and just take a break for a minute and just kind of reassess this practice. And he goes to the stream and he just bathes in it to kind of refresh himself, but he's so weak. I can't even get out of the water. He almost drowns. That same deva makes himself into a branch and holds on to him to save his life, pulls him out and lays him on the bank. And at that moment, there happens to be a chieftain's daughter passing by a villager. And she's got a bowl of rice and milk. And she sees him laying there at death's door. And so she offers him some food. I mean, clearly, he's hungry. And so he takes it and he eats it and he finds himself restored again. His body has luster again. And he has this dawning realization that you can't go too far, obviously, into sensual pleasure, but you also can't go too far into self-mortification. There has to be a middle way. We have to tend these bodies that we came in. They're the vehicle for reaching the truth. So that's where he comes to the realization about the middle path. And after feeling refreshed, of course, his other friends are like, what? He's eating that thing that girl gave him. They're like, oh my God, he's fallen. I mean, we're not going to talk to that guy anymore, because of course they're probably all just like desperately wanting some too, So they're like, they shun him, they go away. Oh, I'm out of time. Anyway, he sits under the Bodhi tree and eventually attains enlightenment and comes to see that the Four Noble Truths, existence is suffering, suffering's caused by desire and aversion. So us wanting and not wanting, and that's all in the mind. There is a way out of suffering, and that way is following the Noble Eightfold Path, which he elaborates. And then his first teaching actually is to those 5 guys who they leave and they're like, oh, we're going to go to Varanasi because it's way more hardcore there. That's Shiva's city, where people go to get cremated and you can meditate in the cremation ground, and it's really hardcore. So they go over there and they're in this deer park in Sarnath outside the city. And finally, after kind of just relishing in his enlightenment, the Buddha realizes my path is to be a teacher. So he travels to Varanasi and he finds those guys in the deer park. And at first they're like, we don't want anything to do with him. But he's glowing like a sun. And they're finally like, yeah, maybe we should humble ourselves and take some teaching. So the first turning of the wheel of Dharma is there. And he talks about the Noble Eightfold Path. And then eventually in his life, he gets many, many disciples, including his father, his wife, everybody from his old kingdom. He goes back because he said, I'll never go back until I understand the truth, but he understood it. Eventually he returns. They all become his disciples. Many, 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 many people are converted to Buddhism. And I think just through the power of his physical presence on the earth at that time, many become awakened and continue the teachings. So that's Buddha Avatar.
Oh, I want to hear more. You're such a good story. I love it. Really, I could sit here all day.
Thank you.
We are going to sing our love song. Now there is love on earth, and it has begun with me. Now there is love on earth, a love that was meant to be. With all our relations, loved ones all are we. Now I walk with my family in perfect harmony. Love has begun with me, and this is the moment now. With every breath I take, let this be my joyous vow. To take each moment and live each moment in love eternally. Now there is love on earth, and it has begun with me. We are the light, the love, and the presence. Wherever we are, love is, and all is well. Woo-hoo-hoo! Thanks for being here. Thank you, Anandi. Next week, we're going to have Willow Brook, who's going to do a Buddhist sort of meditation teaching, and then Mirabai is going to be on the 11th of June. Summertime, and living is easy. It's coming. It's coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you, friends. La, 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 la.